Yes. Moving to the next slide. So why do we need user laws? Laws of user experience. So if we see, designing a user experience means designing a good human experience, right? So as a designer, we have to aim to improve the human experience for people using our product or service. So to do so, we need to keep in mind a collection of laws or design standards that we must take into consideration while improving the user experience. So basically, these laws tells us or reveals us the outcome of what is expected when a certain design decision is made. Meaning, for example, in many sites we see a blue colored text with an underlined blue colored text, right? So our human nature is to go and click it thinking it's a link, but if it's not, then it's not user friendly. So there are certain rules that we need to keep in mind while designing the user interface. So those rules are given in forms of laws by various experts. So let's move on to the first law. Venkat, next slide. Yes, before starting with the first law, let us all do a quick exercise. So what you see in front of the screen is a sequence of digits, right? So what I want you guys to do is to read the sequence of digits from left to right and try to remember it without making a note of it or without writing it down. Just try remembering it in your mind, right? Let me give you a few seconds to do this. So all right. So now what I want you to do, moving to the next slide, Venkat. Yes, try recalling the sequence of digits that you just saw in the previous screen, right? Just close your eyes, try to recall. Yes, it's very hard to remember, right? Like only we get only a part sequence, right? Or we don't remember. That's all right, because all of us are like that. Our human mind is trained like that. So now moving to the next part. So if we try to do the same exercise by splitting the numbers into small groups. Say here we have split the number into three groups of smaller sizes of 3 to 4 elements in each group, right? So now if we try to remember the same, it's very easy to process, and we will be able to recall it very easily, right? So 7, 8, 9, 6, 5, 1, 2 as one group, and then 6, 6, 5 is the last group. Then it's very easy to recall. So if you had noticed, this is how we usually remember phone numbers, isn't it? So moving to the next slide. Yes. So this process of breaking the complex things into groups is called chunking, right? So this is how our human mind is trained to remember long sequence of digits or letters. We try to split them into small groups and then remember. So this is what Miller talked about way back in the previous century. So in 1956, a psychologist named George Miller performed research in which he found what he believed to be the limit of human ability for processing information. So what he found was that most people stored 7 ± 2 things in their short-term memory. So this is what is essentially the Miller's law. So Miller's law states that the average person can keep only up to 7 ± 2 items in their working memory. So let us now look at a couple of examples where Miller's law is put in use. So yes, I'm sure all of us would have faced this huge overwhelming task of entering our card details while making an online transaction, isn't it? Right, the huge card numbers, how many times we would have we saw like back and forth the card and the screen to enter the right details, right? So nowadays this process is actually simplified by chunking the large card number into small groups so that we don't make mistakes while entering it. So this is one of the example of Miller's law. Moving next. Yes, another place where Miller's law is widely used is in famous video streaming platforms. I'm sure most of you guys would have used Netflix, Amazon Prime, or Hotstar to watch TV shows and movies, right? That too, in this lockdown, we have a lot of time in hand. So if we see these types of websites have a lot of like hundreds of categories for films and TV shows to display, but what they do is they just don't display it out as without any layout or something. So what they categorize those into groups, and then they form similar groups and then categorize them into different categories, like genre, or recently added, or recently added or watched, or trending videos and stuff like that. So this makes this helps the user to easily identify and look for what they want very quickly. All right. So moving next, yes. And again, I guess we would have all gone to websites where we have contents shown in without any format or structure as shown in the first picture. This basically increases the cognitive load on users. Like, we don't understand what is going on, and after some time we just leave the site, and it's then there's no point, right? So what we can do as designers is follow this one in the next image, use yeah, the below image, where we have headings, subheadings, and like neatly arranged with the white spaces everywhere to categorize them into sections, so that we can easily so that the users can easily scan and process and find whatever they want. So essentially, this is how many websites like news portals and all display their information. Going to the next slide, I can show you an example where this way of presenting information is used. If we see this, it's not only that it's visually pleasing, but it's also more scannable. Users who want to spend only few minutes have no time, and then just want to get just the main information. They just can get it in one glance. Like, they can skim and understand what is going on. So that's what we want apps to do, right? That's what is called as user friendly, right? So this is what Miller's law was all about. So the main key takeaways from what we all saw is that while designing, we must keep in mind that the users, the capacity of memory that can be stored in the by the users, right? So we have to keep in mind the short-term memory, that only 7 plus or minus 2 items can be stored by them. And based on that, if we organize the content in smaller chunks and present it in a very good way, then it will be very useful for the users as well, and many users will come to your site. Yes. So next, this Tesla's law. So this law is actually named after a famous computer scientist named Larry Tesler. So like, he is actually the co-creator of the most widely and famously now used two options. Any guesses? Like, we use it all the time. Right. Okay. I'll tell the answer. It is Control C and Control V option. Right. So Larry Tesler is a famous computer scientist who is the co-creator of Control C and Control V option, which we guys use very often. Right. So what he stated was, for any system, there is a certain amount of complexity which cannot be reduced. So okay, let us understand this like very nicely with examples. Yeah, okay. So this law is also known as the law of conservation of complexity. I'm sure most of you guys would have come across this famous law called as law of conservation of energy, right? So where it states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. We would have learned it in our school days, isn't it? So it's the very similar way. Even here also, it works a very similar way. Here, the complexity is conserved, and that it cannot be created or destroyed, and it can be transferred from one system to another. So, meaning that every application has an inherent amount of complexity that cannot be removed. So let us understand what we mean by complexity here. So let us consider an example where we want to create an event in the Google Calendar. Okay, so here, if we see, there are some quite few details, I mean more details that we need to ask from the user, and as a user we need to give more information like date, the time, the location where it is remote, where the remote event is going to be conducted, and then whom to invite and when to be notified, the mode of notification, and stuff like that. So if we try to simplify this process by minimizing the number of input that we get from the user, and then you try to create this event at the system level itself, then many things can go wrong, because as a system, it doesn't know when or where the event should be created, right? So that complexity here cannot be reduced. So let us look at one more example. Here in the down, we see two images. So left one is the standard way of login information, and the right one is the now famously trending facial recognition way of authentication. So if we use this facial recognition way of authentication, we cut down the user's necessity to enter details and their effort to remember all the credentials. Instead, we allow the system to automatically automatically authenticate whether to log in or not. So here, what essentially we are doing is we are simplifying the user interface, but we're adding the complexity into the development process, right? So it's true that the facial detection algorithms and the procedure to do that, achieve that, is very complex. So here we're pushing the complexity from user side to the product side. So essentially, here, if we see that the complexity cannot be removed, but it can be either pushed into the user interface or to the product inside. So that's what was all about. And here I would like to add one more point in the previous slide. Can you? Yes. So now the second point, like now who will have to deal with this complexity, right? It has to be either the users or the product. So we have to decide on who. So Tesla here also gives his view that argues that as engineers we should spend more time reducing the complexity on the application instead of making users spend more time on the task that they're trying to perform. So that will make the app more user friendly. Next slide. Yes. Okay. So let us look at one more example where how we can make the complexity how we can reduce the not exactly reduce the complexity, seem to reduce the complexity. So I'll explain how. So here we have an example of creating an email. So we have certain amount of pieces of information that we need, like from whom the message is to be sent, and to whom to be sent, and from, to, and what to be sent, right? So if from and to are not there, then there is no point, it's incomplete, the task cannot be done. So what now the email clients nowadays, like Gmail or Outlook, does is that it automatically pre-populates the sender's address, as it knows who is sending using the account that we log in and all. And while typing in the to address, it also gives suggestions, auto suggestions of the list of email address from its history, from the user's chat history, or from the user's contacts and stuff like that. So it makes as a user, it reduces the effort that I need to put to complete the address. And now we have the smart compose option as well, where it automatically tries to fill in the sentence that we are trying to frame. And now we've got smart reply option as well. So if we see here, What we are doing here is that the complexity here is not entirely gone. It's just abstracted away from the user, and it reduces the effort of the users that they put in to accomplish the task. Right. So actually, if we see, the burden is actually moved from the user to the product here. Yes, this was all about Tesla's law. So the key takeaways that we can get from this Tesla's law is that we have to acknowledge the fact that the complexity of a system cannot be gone, like cannot be removed at all. It has to be it is always there, but we have to find different ways, innovative ways to handle it. And we have to also ensure as much as possible that the burden of this handling is shifted away from the users, and that we deal with the complexity during the development phase. Okay, so before moving on to the next law, so if here on the screen we see a few images of an mobile, our mobile phone desktop, and we have emojis, list of emojis and stuff like that. So do you think we use all the available options? Say for example, you use your smartphones every day, right? But we don't use all the apps that we have in the smartphone, right? So like, can you give examples of what apps that you guys use every day? Like every day, a day will not go without using that app. Any, like, WhatsApp, right? What I use is, yes, Gmail, WhatsApp, phone contacts to call a person. True, yeah, Facebook, yes. So but it depends on the person, like it depends on the task. So we don't exactly use all the available options, even though the phone is capable of hundreds of functions, and it has so many features, but then we use only some of the features that we want. Like out of like 80%, 80% of the time we just use 20% of the apps that are there in the phone, that is on a regular basis. Right. So this is there with everything, every product that we see, even the emojis list. There are like hundreds of emojis that they've come up with, but then we just barely use some, I guess, lol and smiley face and yeah, emojis like that. So my point is that 80% of the time we just use only 20% of the 20% of the features that the product can 20% of the features that the product gives. Okay, so this is what Pareto's principle talks about. Yes. So this law is also known as the law of vital few, where it states that for many events, roughly 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. So it can be used in any context. Like 80% of the revenue comes from 20% of the companies, or like that. To illustrate this law in UX context, it's like saying 80% of your users use only 20% of your features. So it's like simpler to think like this. Like a relatively small number of things have a relatively significant impact. So if this is the case, then why do we have to spend our time on everything? So this is what Pareto's principle teaches us. It tells us that it tells us to prioritize what problems or issues that we need to solve. So we prioritize them according to the necessity. Like we choose the usability issues that are affecting most or significant amount of people, and then we try to resolve them. So in that way, we can be very efficient. We can come up with efficient design, and because we are spending all our resources on it, right? So this way it will save time, resources, energy, and everything. So let us look at some examples. Yeah, so if we see in the left hand side image, this is again an image from Netflix app. So here if we notice that there is a hamburger icon in the right saying more option, right? So here if we see the this lower tabbed menu, what we can see is that the implementation is very straightforward. They have just put the general features that like most of the people use all the time. So like frequently used features in the plain sight, and then they have if you click the more option, you'll get more advanced and less frequently use the feature. So this way we can actually use this principle to prioritize what to show them, what not to. So instead of what they could have done is that instead of having this more option, they could have just displayed everything, but that is not necessary. It will take up space, it clutters, and then it confuses the user what to do. So but what here they've done is they've made it very simple with only 4 options, general, that are very commonly used by the users, and then the more advanced options are put in the more button. So this is one way that many apps present their screen. Next. Yes, of course, Google. So Google is known for its simplicity, right? So if we see 80% of the page is just blank, and then only the main center information is what they do, or what Google is all about. It's famous for its search engine, isn't it? So they've just put their main functionality in the center, and other options, other advanced features, the secondary features that we look for, like Google Docs or Google Docs or Calendar, or everything is put in the top right menu option. So the key takeaway that we can take from this principle is that we need to focus on the elements related to the top 20% of the tasks that are used by almost 80% of the users. So this way it will be very productive, and then you can come up with efficient designs. Yes, so this is going to be my this is going to be the last law from my side. So what we look in the screen is that here, like I'm sure most of us would have been through this situation. So you've clicked a button, or you've performed a task, but then there is no response from the system. So you just get blank screen. So what do you do in this situation?
We try to refresh the screen in case of browser, and in case of app, we may exit the app and restart the app again.
Exactly, yeah, we just come out of the application, or try to go back, and then we just become restless, isn't it? We don't know where the issue is, right? So we don't know if it's a bug, or if our device is frozen, or sometimes we may start wondering if the app uses internet and the internet is low, and then eventually we start rage clicking, and then the frustration grows. So that's how it is. So there's a law which talks about this. Let us look at that. Next screen. Yes, that is the law called Dorothy threshold. So basically, Dorothy threshold states that the productivity soars when a computer and its users interact at a pace less than 400 milliseconds that ensures neither has to wait on the other. Okay, let us understand what this is all about. So this law essentially states that if a user is perceived to be left waiting for a system to respond, like what happened in the previous slide, right? So respond to if we start waiting for the system to respond to our request, so eventually we start losing attention, and then it leads to less productivity, and then we sometimes it happens that we may never go back to that site as well. So the optimum time that a user expects a response is 400 milliseconds. Through research, they have found this. So anything more than that leads only to frustration and and then they start going away from your product. So to reduce this frustration, so what designers have come up with that is that they add UI items like progress bars or pop-ups or animations. Like if you see in this image, this is an app called Deliveroo, right? So whenever we search for restaurants on this app, if there is a slight delay, or if something is loading in the background, so what they do is to keep their users engaged during that lag time, they use pop-up windows, small pop-up windows, to conveying an offer that they have, or information on how to redeem it and stuff like that. So this way they try to keep up the user's attention, and without knowing that they are so essentially what happens here is that users get distracted in these pop-up items that they don't know that they're waiting. So let us look at some more examples how applications use this Dorothy threshold time in their applications. So some apps like LinkedIn, YouTube, and all, they use what is known as skeleton screens. So we here, if you see in the middle, you see a skeleton screen of the items that are yet to be loaded. So this way, it reduces the impression of waiting for the user. So what users think is that okay. For their request, something is loading in the background. So that's how we tell the users that okay, like we are processing your request, right? So and Gmail uses some animation like this, and Amazon uses some animation like this. So animations are yet another way to physically like visually engage people while the processing is happening in the background. Yes, so next slide. So some more techniques that can be used are the ones shown up in the right side is like blurring up of the image. So when your website loads contents and it has images, usually we know that images take time to load, isn't it? So what we can do is that we can show a blurred version of the image instead of not showing anything at all. So okay, they assume that okay, it's loading, and till then they can read all the content, read the text while they're waiting. So that is one way. So another way where most applications use is the progress bars. So these are called as percent done progress bars. So they indicate how much of the task is actually completed. Right. So research has actually shown that if by simply seeing a progress bar can make wait times more tolerable, regardless of the accuracy. But then you're showing something to the viewers, right? So they don't feel like they're actually waiting for something. So they are occupied with these visual distractions. So these as I told before, these techniques reassures people that their action is being processed, and also provides visual interest while they wait. So these were some of the techniques that you can use to engage your users during your Dorothy threshold or the 400 milliseconds time. But there is also like too much of wait time. Even if you use all these stuff, it doesn't matter. Like they just leave if your application is taking a longer time to load. So only like we have the leverage of 400 milliseconds. So the key takeaways from Dorothy threshold is that we need to provide some kind of feedback, like any kind of feedback. It can be an animation or a loading bar or a circular loading bar or and anything like that, pop-up windows within a time limit of 400 milliseconds in order to keep them engaged. So we're actually assuring them that okay, we are doing something in the background rather than just displaying blank screen where nothing is happening, nobody knows what is going on. So for that, to engage them, we can use as I told, we can use animations and all. So this actually helps to reduce the perception of waiting by the users. So this is all from my side. Now Vaibhav will take you all through some more laws, after which thank you.
Yeah, Venkat, you can stop presenting. Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, Vaibhav,
Yeah,
you're
you're
audible.
audible.
Yeah.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. So yeah, so Arul had taken you through, 4 laws. So I'm also gonna talk about a few more laws. So before I start, let's start with a quick exercise. So the drill would be like I'll show you a few examples, or like I'll ask you to probably like you can answer in chat or you can raise hands. Right. So yeah, this is the first exercise, a small one. So like, does anyone of you over here know like a design choice which OnePlus 6 had, but then it didn't have any purpose to it? And the hint for you is most of the premium phones have this design or this design feature. I like most of the phones these days, the premium phones have this thing. Like if anybody could answer it in chat. Okay. Okay. Fine. So the answer is glass backs. No, not really, not the notch, the glass backs. So the reason why, most of the phones had this glass back was because, they supported this wireless charging. So wireless charging basically, like you keep your phone on a pad and then it starts charging wirelessly. So glass as a material actually helps for charging it wirelessly. Like with metal, that electromagnetic induction won't actually, cross through metal. So because of that, this was a design feature like most of the premium phones, because those are the ones which had wireless charging. They supported it. So now, like there are phones like OnePlus 6, right? Like they have glass back, and there's they're more fragile. But then why? And they don't even have this feature of wireless charging. So why do you think such companies go with this design choice of having a glass at the back of the phones? Again, like if anybody could answer this question in the chat. Or if you don't know, you can just say no and I can continue with my presentation. Okay, definitely they get a lot of money with the service. Okay, so I'll carry on. So it's mainly because of aesthetics, like a glass phone, like if you have, glass at the back, like it actually feels more premium than using a metal or a plastic back. So now, and the reason, so you can see the thing, right? Like why, even though they have a glass back, and we all know, like, it makes the phone more fragile, and once you break it, that's it. Like you will have to shell out a lot of money. And even though you have this, like when you buy a phone, right? These days, you're anyways gonna put one cover on top of it, right? So basically, there's no purpose to the back, right? The glass back, but then still people buy it. So this is basically this aesthetic usability effect, wherein people are more tolerant towards this minor usability issues, with designs which are more aesthetically pleasing. So we all know that, it's anyway gonna cause us some discomfort, and we'll have to shell out more money for getting some covers and stuff like that, right? Uh, yeah. So this is this effect. So I'll go through. So this is the statement of the effect. A statement of the law. Users perceive aesthetically pleasing design as as a design that is more usable, even though that might not, add any benefit, or it might not be that great of a design choice. But then still, people like things which are more aesthetically pleasing. So yeah, another question, or yeah, this is one more example. So like, how many over here have a laptop with a removable battery? People can raise hands. Yeah, so like we can see over here, right? Like around 100 people are there on the call, and I guess maybe 10 to 20, or even if we take 30 people, right? So that number is less. So the reason again why this removable battery from laptops were removed was because of aesthetics. These days, everybody like Apple, Samsung, and all, HP, everybody has, this ultra thin, slick laptops, right? That's basically the reason, right? Again, because of aesthetics, they've actually removed this feature of removable battery. Even though, like, having a removable battery is such a good thing, because, like, when your laptop freezes, you can just take it out. Or if you have to go for a travel, you can carry one more extra battery, like wherein you won't have a plug point or something, you can carry one more battery. But then again, this feature was removed because, people wanted the, very thin, aesthetically pleasing laptops, right? So that's one more example of it. So yeah, okay, I'll be actually happy if anybody could answer this question. Yeah, exactly, portable too. So do you think people these days, buy a radio? And I'm not talking about, people as in like old people and all, or even people living in villages. I am talking about like urban, I mean, this new age, like people like us, right? Like still buying radios. Okay. So yeah, you'll, yeah, please carry on. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, with this smartphones and all, right? Like it comes inbuilt, but I'm talking specifically buying a radio in this modern age. So yeah, like as I see, people are saying no. But then here's one interesting case study. Exactly, yeah, a Carvan. Here is, very interesting case study. People are, these Saregama Carvan, this device is actually selling out, like people are actually enjoying this device a lot. And the reason being, like, if you see the thing, right, if you see the device, it actually looks bulky. And I guess there are just some 5,000 preloaded songs. And I think so, like, you cannot load more. So even when we have this age of, like in 2000s, we had iPods, which were like, very, what do you say, portable and easy to carry around, and you can just put it in your pockets and stuff like that, right? And people are still buying this. And if you see the features, like if you actually deconstruct this or dismantle this thing, right, like what's basically inside, it's just a basic, what do you say, like the components, we all have it in our phones, right? And still they cost, I guess, around 5,000 or so. And the reason again, because of this aesthetics, like, taking into that nostalgia. So again, these aesthetics, it's because of that people are actually buying it. So yeah, a pretty design can make users more forgiving of minor usability problems, but not of the larger ones. So yeah, like how I told about that rear glass, right? Those are minor usability problems. People are still ready to, stay with it and all. But then you cannot, like, by this law, what do you mean? Is basically like, a less usable design can be made more usable, or it can be perceived to make more usable just by having pretty aesthetics. But that does not mean that, just because if you have aesthetics, you can actually have a great product. It's just to a certain limit. So I'll take you through one case study of this. So that is this Apple MacBook's keyboard design. So traditionally, all the computers or all the laptops have been using this scissor mechanism for the keyboards. Like if you just remove the key from your keyboard, you'll see this design. This is known as the scissor mechanism. So what Apple did was, in order to make their laptops even more thin, they went with this butterfly mechanism. So they developed it and they started using this butterfly mechanism. They had put it in a few of their MacBooks, and then users started complaining of issues such as, like it won't record your keystrokes, or sometimes like one time you press E, it will be like, printed many times on the screen. So those sort of issues started popping up, and even it seems dust and all got inside very easily. So they try, like they were actually going for aesthetics, but then the basic thing of a keyboard, right? Uh, Yeah, that basic thing of a keyboard, like you need to get proper keystrokes, right? That basic usability itself was lost. So, I mean, you cannot put aesthetics over usability. So that form and the function of the device should go hand in hand. You cannot, like you cannot give more priority to form over function. So basically, yeah, this is one case study. So the key takeaways from this effect is an aesthetically pleasing design creates a positive response in people's brains and leads them to, believe that it actually works better. In theory, it might not, but then, whenever you ask a person, right? I mean, how is it? Like just by the looks, they would actually say, not, merely by performance. Like only maybe the technical audience would go more towards the performance, but then, the average consumer would go more towards aesthetics. So again, the second point is people are more tolerant towards minor usability issues of a design when it's aesthetically pleasing. And yeah, the third point, there is so visually pleasing design can actually mask these usability problems. But then there's one more aspect to it. When you're actually, like, if you are creating a product and you give it to someone to, get their feedback, right? Like initially we get some feedback from people saying that, okay, so that you can iterate towards it to, so that like iterate and it becomes a better product before a mass release. But the thing is, when you actually give it to someone, again, it's that psychological thing, right? Like, I mean, you actually want to know what are the real pain points of that product. But then again, aesthetics would come in the way of that usability testing as well. So, we need to ask those some right questions, and we need to do that testing properly so that aesthetics do not, prevent these issues to be solved before releasing your product, in mass market. So that was aesthetic usability effect. So now coming on to the next law. So again, I have a quick exercise. Um, why do you think this brake pedal is larger as compared to accelerator pedal? Okay, yes, it is. Yeah, so basically, like if this brake pedal, right, like in case of an emergency or something, right, like you can actually, like, if that area is more, you can actually press it, right? So yeah, it's like safeties first, the contact surface area, exactly. So the contact area is more. So you can press it easily and even faster. Like for quick responses, you can, press the brake. So that's why it's easy to handle, true. So this we can see is due to Fitz's law. So actually what Fitz tried to say was that time to acquire a target is a function of distance and the size of the target. So in case of a brake pedal, it's the size, like as compared to accelerator, the size of the brake is larger. So yeah, here's the Fitz formula. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into the maths of it. It's just for your, future reference. So you can see that the time is it's directly proportional to the distance and inversely proportional to the width. So the more the distance, the more time you're going to take, and the lesser the distance, lesser time, as well as it's inversely proportional to the width. So more the width, you're going to take again less time to respond, and vice versa. So, like while designing, what you should basically take care of is creating larger, yeah, shorter response time. So yeah, creating larger targets. Like over here, you can see if we have a, a larger login button, it's much easier to click, and minimizing the movement. So placing similar use functions or features together helps reduce the cursor movement. So suppose if you have your cursor on the cut, right? So basically what do? We do cut and paste. So if we have it on cut, like if your cursor is on cut, you can see the distance to move to paste is very short. It's not going to require that much amount of time. So yeah, again, in this case, like if you have to stop, right? Like suppose, example, if it's some nuclear reactor or some other maybe electricity board or something. Like in case of emergency, if you need to stop, you need to have that button, like a really big button, so that you can press it very fast in case of emergencies. Yeah, it's easier to to respond faster and easy to focus. Yes. So now while designing, so this is basically an example of web, like if you're designing some website, or you can use it anywhere else as well. So if you see on the right hand side, this sign up thing, right? So this pink color denotes the target area. So in the first figure, if you just click on sign up text, it's gonna be marked as a click thing, right? But in the second one, if you click inside that entire, like inside that rectangular region, it's gonna be marked as a button click, or it will be recorded as a button click. So the second design, it's much easier to click the button. As well as in the left hand side, if you see, basically the input which we are going to take is on in this text box only, but then we can actually have it in a way that even this label is included inside that click. So if a user presses on even that username, it would actually start that that blinking cursor inside that input. So having a bigger target area actually helps us. And similarly, you can see, so that was for bigger target area. This is for the distance. So given a form, right? I mean, the best place to have this submit button is over here. Reason being, you're gonna go in order. Like first you're gonna fill in address 1, then address 2, then city, and then zip code. So the last field which you're gonna be is inside that zip code field. So then traveling or cursor, or even your hands, right, like touch screen phones, even your hands, it's much easier because you're already typing on that zip code thing, or your cursor is on that zip code field. Clicking on that submit button is a relatively very shorter distance as compared to others. So again, this one shows that same thing, having bigger buttons and the distance. This is a worse thing. This is much better. So it's basically a function of distance and area. So coming to the phones, the general size phones, right? This area, the darker blue shade is the most accurate ones, and the corners, right? The topmost corners are the ones wherein, like we are. Like we'll have to use two hands to actually reach those corners, so they are a little more difficult to touch. So this is more accurate area. Now I'll come to a case study of okay, can anybody tell which phone, or I mean which operating system is this? Then I'll actually talk about its case study. Yes, it is an Android. I'm asking for the company. I mean, just by the UI, can you tell which company's phone? Yeah, Samsung, right? So this is basically Samsung's One UI. I guess it was launched very recently. I mean, like I think so, 2015-16, not before then. Before that. So initially, Samsung was using something called TouchWiz. That was their operating system on top of Android, right? And then Samsung transitioned towards One UI, and now we can see all these, examples of Fitz law in this One UI. So if you actually see what Samsung did with One UI was they moved in. Like generally, we had this concept of having this contacts button, then that phone menu, and the address book all in that phone on the top bar. But what Samsung basically did was they moved it towards the bottom. So if you can see over here, you can see conversations, contacts, and chat box or chat text, something like that. Yeah. So That was because Samsung is manufacturing, phones which are like really huge, like the Note series and all are like really huge, right? So to handle it with one hand, I mean, they shifted that entire bar down because it's very easy to click, in the bottom buttons with one hand rather than two hands. Like if it's on the top, you'll actually require two hands to use it. This issue, we did not face it earlier because we had smaller phones back then. But now, even with the touchscreen phones, when in 2007 Apple introduced its iPhone, those were of relatively shorter sizes, and Samsung was the one that actually started this trend of having larger screen phones. So now that was the time when they shifted towards this one UI. And one more thing which you can notice over here is the messages. Yeah, exactly. Easy to access. The reason why it's easy to access is because you're gonna have in a normal situation that placement of your thumb is gonna be towards the like when you hold your phone, it's gonna be towards the center of your phone. So accessing the bottom one is really easy rather than the top ones when your phone is vertically longer. And one more thing which you can see over here is the messages, instead of starting from the topmost, it's starting like from the bottom part, or the first half is known as the the viewing area, and second half is known as the interaction area. So it's only starting from the second half in that interaction area. So it's actually easier to click, or else generally in a normal situation in many other OSs, what we have is if we need to access the first message, we'll have to use the other hand to access it. So that's the case study, and yeah, that's what Samsung actually brought in, and even OnePlus followed the same with its Oxygen OS. Now it almost looks similar to Samsung's OS, and even Android is slowly, getting these features in Android 11 and probably even in 12. Even they're going to make phones more accessible, like easily accessible with one hand in coming future. And yeah, one more example to this is like when you right click, these pop-up menus, they actually appear wherever you have right click. So the distance between the click and these options is very small. So yeah, and here's a quick exercise. I'll just post it in the chat box. So yeah, for 2 minutes, everyone can try out this exercise. Basically, yeah, I'll just share it with. Okay, so 1 minute. Yeah, over here you can see this diagram, right? Diagram or yeah, this is the exercise. Like just try clicking on this red circle, and you can see like you can just go for 2 iterations. I'm not asking you to go through the these graphs and all those have some mathematical equations. But then if you actually do this exercise, right, you can know the difference, or you can actually feel the difference by yourself. That when the button size is small and when it's far away, so you can feel the difference of how much time it's taking. And you can understand this law. So I'll wait for 2 minutes. You can all try out this exercise. And you can have the feel of the law, right? Yeah, it is completely opposite. That's what, right? Like once your mouse is completely opposite, you need to travel a larger distance to do it. And that distance you can see, like when it has a larger circle, it's going to be a much more shorter distance to travel. So that's basically what the law says, right? Like you can have that feel that when those circles are like really small and when they're large and when they're far apart, so you'll have to, travel a lot. So that is what, the users, like when you design a website or if you design a product, they don't want to move that much. And that's basically a pain point. Yeah, response time is less in bigger circles. So you can connect it with that equation and other things or the other examples what I've talked about. Okay, so let's continue. So this was all about the Fitts law. I hope my screen is still visible. So the key takeaways from this law is that the touch target should be large enough for the users to.
Why
Oh, it's not.
in
Okay.
the first link it's not.
Yeah, is it visible now?
Yeah, now it's visible.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so this was all about the Fitts law. And the key takeaway from these laws are as follows. The touch target should be large enough for users to accurately select them. They should have ample spacing between them. And the touch target should be placed in areas of an interface that allows them to be easily acquired. So this was all about the Fitts law. So now coming on to the next law, I think, yeah, this is the last law what I'm going to talk about today. And then Venkat is going to continue after this. So yeah, this is a pretty fun one. I want to know, like, if somebody actually faces, because I have been through this myself. Recall your first visit to a Subway and compare it to McDonald's. Like, which one did you find easy, difficult, or what was your experience? Like, I'm looking for an answer. Let's see if you can, get the thing. So, what's basically the difference between a Subway and McDonald's? Yeah, McD is easy. So, what is actually difficult in Subway when you go for the first time? Exactly. Yeah. Subway gives a lot of options. It's confusing. Yeah, that's the point, right? Which I'm looking for. So if you see, Subway has options starting from, the choice of bread. They have, some 10 or 15 options of, or I guess, yeah, 5 options of bread. And then they have various fillings or the toppings which are there inside the bread. Then they have a large variety of sauces which I mean most of us don't even remember the names or don't even kind of recollect. So they basically have so many options. Like we always feel having options is good, but then if you consider as a new experience, when you're given so many options, it's actually very confusing to where to start from. And those options, most of them you don't even know what do they mean or how is it going to taste. So that's basically the pain point which you have. And if you compare it with the McDonald's, right, you just go and you can order one Mac Aloo Tikki, or there are some Whoppers and stuff like that, even in Burger King, right? So they have pretty limited options and you needn't tell them. So yeah, exactly, having too many options is confusing. Similarly, in the next example, right, like consider like if a nuclear reactor is overheating and it's just gonna, go off, and you have so many buttons here and there, at that time you're not going to search for a manual, right? So having a one choice or having only few options in such a situation, or having only the most important options is, really helpful. Yeah, we get hanged to decide what to do now. Like, we are so much confused, like what should we do, as well as like in such a situation we would be getting some signals from the sound, our eyes would be seeing something, we might be smelling that burning thing or something like that, right? Like so many different things to move, so many different things to choose, and we are all of a sudden confused. And sometimes in such a situation we just stand still, right? Because we don't know, there's so much information to process. So this is basically the Higgs law. So what it says, the time taken to make a decision increases as the number of choices and the complexity of choices available with us increases. So over here in the graph, you can see, right? Like, okay, so the x-axis is number of options, and y-axis is the reaction time. So when you are a new user, right? Like suppose if you go to Subway, when you're a new user, you're going to take a lot of time because the number of options are more, and it's very new to you. And as you start ordering from Subway, after a while it would be much quicker, and then later on you'll actually know all, most of the options. You'll remember it, or you'll even remember what your favorite one is, and it will hardly take you time. So this is basically what the graph says. So Higgs law, it tries to predict the time and effort it takes to make a decision, and it increases with number of options. So the ways to improve, okay, sorry. Yeah, so this is basically the Higgs formula. So you can see again, it's a logarithmic function, and it is directly proportional to the number of options. Giving options is great, but having even too many options is actually going to be, it's going to increase the cognitive load on the user. So that we don't want when we, give user a product, or, like on a website, that you wouldn't want, because then the user would just like that leave, because they would be so confused they would leave, and nobody would like that. So the ways to improve this is by categorizing the choices. We can have it into in a situation where it's inevitable to have many options, it's good to categorize them. And even breaking it down, right? Breaking it down and having it into smaller tasks. So these two things you would have actually seen when Arul explained Miller's law. So these two are sort of related. I mean, you can combine these two laws if you design a product, or if you design a website, or any sort of thing like that, right? So now let's see the examples. So if you see in the first one, right, like there are three options, orange, grape and banana, and then you have so many options. So it becomes difficult. Like you'll have to actually think about every option and then decide. So that's going to take time. Again, similar to the bottom. Yeah, this similarly the bottom one, when you have just two options, it's much you're very quick in taking your actions, and as the number of options increase, it's going to take time, like the response time is going to increase. So this is basically the thing, right? In this one, I know the picture is not very clear, but then please tolerate, these options, like so many options, just like that, it's just placed in that horizontal fashion. Instead of that, we could actually chunk them into different sections. That's what basically these telephone directories and all do, right? Or those yellow pages a thing, right? Like when you have it in that ABC, or into different categories of some carpenter and mm, such sort of services, when it is actually chunked, it's much easier to find, or your response time is going to be faster. So this is an example of Starbucks menu. They have categorized it into two options. The next example is about this television remote, right? Like if you see over here on the left hand side, this television remote, like there's so many options. And, to try out such designs and all, the best people to do it are the ones like, your old family members and, the people who are not at all related to the field or like very inexperienced people, right? Those are the true audience where you actually know whether your design is going to work or not. Like basically there's so many buttons, especially towards the back side, right? This play, pause, and then red, yellow, blue. Like, our grandparents and all find it really difficult to, click, or they don't even do that. Like how we saw in Pareto's law, right? Given so many options, like 80% of the time we don't even use those options. It's only those 20% of those options we're going to use. So why to have so many options and confuse the end user? So basically, this is an example of, I guess this is Amazon Fire Stick. Yeah, Amazon Fire Stick's remote. Similarly, even Apple TV has, such a minimalistic remote design, wherein, these cluttered features and all, they have been pushed towards the OS. Yeah, okay. Even Samsung, it seems. So they are actually, these options are pushed to the OS instead of, having it on the remote. So when such a thing happens, right, it's like basically either your cognitive load increases or your that muscle memory, right? Like that 1, 2, 3, you'll actually like without seeing the remote, either you'll have to see and type it, or it would be like, you remember the position of the buttons and then you type it. So either way, it's bad for the end user. The next example, again, like, this rightmost one, it's easiest of all because limited number of options and all. Then next one is easier, and the last one is the hardest, because again, given so many options, it's going to be difficult. And yeah, here is an example of Walmart's page and Amazon's page. So basically in such a situation, right, like where you need to have options, there's no way you can not have options. So they subcategorize them into, various sections. So it's easier for the user to select that particular section and then reach. And then you have this Amazon's one-click buy button. So it's again, faster and quicker and all those things. So yeah, till now I was talking about having less number of examples. So again, it's like having less number of examples does not mean that you should, oversimplify it to such a level that it actually again increases the cognitive load, right? So it should not be in that way also. You need to strike a right balance between, giving those number of options. You should give only the important ones and the, ones which are really required in that situation, but you shouldn't oversimplify it to such a level that users need to remember it, because then it's going to be difficult. So this is an example of Facebook and Twitter. Their designs might have changed, but then this is some old example. So over here you can see the number of options which Facebook has, right? Like it's so limited. But then the thing is, what do these icons mean? Like for a new user, he wouldn't know, right? This bell icon mean notifications, and then this hamburger menu, this profile thing and all, right? So a new user, for a new user, it's going to be really difficult. And even if you use it for 1 or 2 times, again, you wouldn't remember. You'll have to, constantly use it to remember that, okay, this means that. And this is Twitter's design, wherein they have this label as well. So they have their icons, even they have limited number of icons, but then they do have their labels also, so that one can read it and understand, okay, this is what this means, like home, moments, notification, and messages. So we need to avoid oversimplification as well. So here are the key takeaways from the Hicks law. Minimize choices when response times are critical to increase decision time. That's basically the example of that nuclear reactor, the brake and all, right? Like, I mean, okay, not the brake, but then having yeah, like having less number of choices, especially in the cases when it's it's going to be required in case of an emergency, and break complex tasks into smaller ones in order to decrease the cognitive load, and use progressive onboarding to minimize cognitive load for new users. So this onboarding, this actually Subway has this problem of, like for a new user to try out Subway, either he needs to, be guided by the chef over there, or he needs to go with a person who's actually experienced, like who has already ordered from Subway and knows about, okay, this is how it's done and which would be nice. So that's actually basically going to kill your customers, right? Like you won't be able to have more audience. So again, you need to have that progressive onboarding. It should be, less number of options, as well as it shouldn't be oversimplified as well. So yeah, that's it from my side. We'll go in for a short break, and I guess we can start at 4 o'clock. Venkat, is that fine with you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. We'll start at 4, so you can take a short break and join back.
Design. So at the end of this session, we would actually see how we can build up a real-time application which we actually download from, like which actually behaves like the one which we download from Play Store without writing any code. Yeah. So if you move on to the first main stage of the product development is UX design. So most of you would have known by now with the sessions in the morning and now. UX design is basically how we interact with the application, how the user interacts with the application, the overall journey of how the user focuses, how the user gets benefited from the application. So which is a prior and main thing which we have to focus on the development process. So there are many small companies even achieved it to a greater scale, and there are even a large MNC companies like Google which even failed in achieving it. So a right mix of design principles along with the application development would make the product more successful. So there are three major things in UX design. The primary thing is user research, then wireframing and prototyping, and interaction design. We'll focus much about user research and wireframing and prototyping and interaction design in the later sessions. So if we move on to the first one, user research, this mainly focuses on understanding the user behavior and needs. So morning Ishan talked about Ola. So basically what Ola's aim is to regularize the market of cab. So that was the need which the Ola has been facing up. The Ola has been trying to solve. And the motivation through the observation is to bring every cab holder, like every car holders and cab drivers under the same umbrella, provide a free, secure, safe, and low-cost model for commuters to use the journey or ride-sharing platform. So this basically done through a lot of observation techniques, task analysis, and other feedback methodologies, which we'll be seeing now. So the first methodology which we are going to focus on, user research. User research is basically a complete study about the user, who are all the stakeholders of the product. So the first one which we use is user personas, which is basically a representation of an average users, like a set of all cumulative users under the umbrella of an application, who are the users of the either directly or indirectly. So most of the user personas include a gathering of needs, motivation, the skill sets and the technology which the user has and which the user expects from an application. The demographic data, this majorly modifies certainly the development process of an application, as each and every demography has certain number of needs. Let's take an easy example of how an application is being developed in India or other countries and compared to UAE. Basically, UAE needs to be developed, like the text and fonts need to be written right to left, which is like unconventional here, like where we follow left to right. So all those major social status and stuffs are more important in gathering people to an application. The next part of user research is developing a user journey map. So this is basically a model of typical users' behavior with the product. So generally, the product evolves when there is a need for a particular cause. So once there is a need, there will be initial consideration among the users whether to use the product or not. So the companies has to develop a model to actively engage the users in using the product. So lots of steps that are being taken, like to give a beta trial, to give to run the campaign, to make the people understand how the product is, and all those engagements are being done to gather the attention of the people. Once the attention of the people is gathered, the company poses, or the user or the developer poses a set of rules which the product is being developed on, and the feedback is being captured regularly through surveys and forms. Through this, the developer has an idea of what the exact focus on the consumer to get the product, to make them use it. Then after convincing the user, there will be a purchase from the user, then there will be a delivery. Once they use it, we need to provide frequent services to the product. So it's not only designing the product, the overall steps that involved in developing a product are from the generation of concept till providing the service after selling the product. All these things had to be developed beforehand in order to become a successful developer. The user journey maps broadly classified into 5 categories. One is the customer journey maps. So let's take an example of Amazon. So once the product is being listed into a page, many users will be seeing the product. If they are in need of the product, they either purchase it or they move on to the next product. Once they purchase it, they actually get the product, get actually used to the product. If it is of the use for them, they'll continue using it, giving the positive feedback, and which in turn enables the data science model behind the Amazon to have more recommendation of this product, as this has been gained more views from other customers as a referral to plenty of other customers in the platform, which basically increases the reach of the product. If not, there will be a negative impact, there will be negative reviews which will be flowing through the product. So the product developers has to make a clean note of the negative issues that have been denoted by the users, as only the negative feedback cycle improves the product greatly. So the customer funnel looks similar to the picture shown below. Initially get the customer, acquire them, activate to use your product, keep the customer. How do we keep the customer? Engage into your program. So providing frequent services, getting in touch with them frequently in order to evaluate the product further, give coupons or some of the freebies which attract the products in their future lineup, and give regular updates about the products, etc. And upsell the product. Ask the customers to spread the word among the products, cross-sell it through referrals, and this will continue as a feedback loop once the product goes. So this basically shows how the user interacts with the app or the website. The next is the service blueprint. So this is basically a simplified representation of technical functionalities and the interface. So if we take a example of a Burger King or McDonald's, so basically once we enter into a firm, we are obviously greeted by a McDonald's personnel, and we'll be asked to list out the product, food items which we need, and will be taken on order. So once the order is given, those are the checklists which the cooks and the McDonald's team has to fulfill. So in order to fulfill those checklists, they initially have a set of inventories like the burger buns, the salads, vegetables, fruits, cheese, sauce, etc. in their inventory. So they'll have to pick up a right amount of ingredients beforehand, which are already prepared or which will be prepared live, and they have to assemble each and everything together. with the proper set. So once assembly is done, we'll be collecting an order and we'll be taking it after the payment. So this would be the basic workflow of how the functional representation of the food chain firm works. So similarly, similar concepts can be applied to all the firms. Like if you take an example of again Amazon, we'll have the list of products. Once the user logs into his Amazon website, he'll be shown the list of products that are listed in the page. If it is available, it will be shown. If it is not available, it will be mentioned there. It's currently unavailable. Please give your mail ID for future requests upon arrival. So yeah. So next, if we move on to the experience map. So this provides all possible scenarios of user experience. So there are like various amounts of users which have like different opinions over the product and services. Some users might be satisfied at the first moment. Some users might not like the service which they intend to contact to support systems or their customer service center. They get the feedback, they improve upon the product, and they get to know more about the product on the other hand, which will increase their usability, which will increase the customer's usability over the product, which in turn like quantifies the quality of the product and services which the company is providing at. All these things are interlinked to one another quantitatively and qualitatively. The next major visual cues which we can bring upon the user journey maps are the spatial maps. So this we have been like using it knowingly or unknowingly. Like there are a wide range of 3D models which is being used in exporting the user interface. Some of them includes from the basic Uber maps. Like if you are booking a cab, we'll be given a cues of where the car actually is. Instead of giving the location in text, will be shown in the maps where either from the Zomato where the current order is at. And to the advanced state, we have augmented reality feature added to a Google Map. When we roam around with the phone around the streets, which will exactly point out where we have to go along with the visual cues of directions on the floor and indicating this is the shop, these are the details, these are the things which we get. All those three-dimensional visual cues will help the user attract to get to know more about the product. Some of the major impact that has in the user journey is the mental model. This describes the user's behavior or motivation towards the product. It also analyzes the needs and the risk. So one of the basic mental model like, which we all have around us, like if at all if you want to know if you want to explore something else, we directly go and Google them, which is a kind of mental model which we have developed. If you want to know more about the marathons, we'll just Google them. If you want to register in some contest, we'll Google them. We'll go to the specific site, we'll register them. So all these basic mental models should be taken into an account while developing a product accordingly. And no product should violate a basic mental model which everyone follows. The next comes is the wireframing. Wireframing is the most essential part of the design. This is a mock-up with the main design elements and functionalities of the product. So what does wireframe provides actually? So it provides a presentation of the content. Let's say we are developing a login system. So what are all the basic things we need in the login system? The thing should first come into mind is the username, the password, forget password, login, or sign up. Those 5 functionalities should be mandatorily present in an application. So once we developed this interface of, you can see in the leftmost image, this is how the application look like. So once we click on sign up to the product, what are all the basic things which we need, which we imagine to put it in our product, are being developed virtually through these wireframes. So we need logins, password, emails, first name, last name, like, and other details to know more about the person. And once we click on register, either we'll be sent a notification for verification, or will be showing a successful pop-up on registering. So these are the various stages that we undergo while registering. So to put all those things into a place for visualization, we use wireframes to create all those interactions. So this is another kind of simple wireframe, which is basically showing up a site similar to Make My Trip, which contains a hotel name, the ratings, the description about the hotels, what are all the various things which a user needs when he goes to the particular site, like a overview, facility, reviews, photos, like the number of rooms available, the cost, and all those details has to be presented with all laws satisfying, with all the visual cues, which can cognitively make the user more dig deep into it. The next thing it provides is the outline of the page. So when we are developing a design, let's say a complete application, so it might have like a plenty of scenes. So what are the navigations? How are each and every screen related to one another? So if there are 3 buttons in the first screen, what are all the 3 buttons navigate to further onto future screens? Like if you could see the first one, like it shows various navigation signs. When a button is clicked, it will move on to here again, it will be sent back to the initial screen. So all those interactions are being developed using wireframes. It also gives the style of the interface for further improvements. So each and every company has a certain way of styling, has a certain way of showing the users how they are. So it also helps us to create all those virtual elements which we can put it into an application, ranging from a simple toggle bar to a notification pop-up, how the map should look like, how the user profile should look like, how the font, text, and the color schemes should look like, how it depicts the way how it supports the motto of the company, the colors, shapes, the charts, and so on and so forth. There are plenty of design cues which have to be focused on, which only wireframe and prototypes can bring it up in life. So the next we see about prototyping the wireframe. So we basically created the design cues. We just put what we think into a paper or into a software as a rough sketch. So prototyping is to create advanced interactions and mimicking the user journeys using logic handles, input data, and much more. So what this prototyping basically is. So as you could see the screen here, so there are 3 pictures. What does those 3 signifies? It all signifies the same product, but all those signifies different stages of evolution of design. The first one is the wireframe, which is a basic sketch of the product. Mockup is to bring up visual cues, adding up colors, bringing up more detailed visual interactions with the product. And the prototype is basically to mimic the application with the logic systems and interactions, so that the user can basically interact with the product by sliding up, sliding down, exploring the features before even begin the development phase of actual coding. This basically reduces the rapid turnaround time in product development. So the wireframe contains the concept which we discussed before, and the mockup contains visual graphic content, and the prototype contains deep visual representation of the product. There are basically 2 types of prototypes. One is the low fidelity one, which you could see in the leftmost side. The other one is a high fidelity one, which are further more advanced and detailed visual representations in the application with user interactions. This is an example of low fidelity one versus high fidelity one in a website development, where we could see actual shape and design of the icons are mentioned in high fidelity one, unlike a low fidelity one, which shows the placeholders of what has to be placed in specific set of places. Okay, we have seen about prototyping. Then what is an effective prototyping does? So it basically helps us to test the basic product version before even actually starting out to code. It helps to find the design cues which we have to focus further on. What are all the things lacking in the application? Are there any attraction towards customers? The second one it basically focuses on is to agree upon common functionality and design among the team during product development. It also later helps in plan workload of product management and program management team, and further dig deep into software development with the design. So the next major stage is the UI design. So basically we have seen all those laws and interfaces, how the product's interface should look like and the functions, how to create intuitive and aesthetically pleasing interactions by following those user UI design laws and heuristics, which you have already seen before. So I'll not be going into that. Now let's see some of the most commonly used UI UX tools, ranging from a smaller industry, from academia to MNCs. So the most common wireframe, basic wireframe tool used is the Balsamiq. It's a graphical user interface. It basically mimics how we write using softwares. It's a low fidelity prototyping, and it simulates the user interactions. It can be done using easy drag and drop simulations. The next one is a Sketch. It's a vector-based tool. So the major advantage of the vector-based tool is to scale the design like to a larger extent without losing visual impairment on the visuals, on the images. So it's quick and intuitive interface design. It's lightweight software, and it also provides a functionality to us as and when if we skip the as and when if we drag and drop the interfaces, and we can import it to a code in a matter of seconds. The next one is Zeppelin. It's basically a plugin which used in other design tools to export the design into a code. It also generates a CSS interfaces, which will be time saving for front end developers. Some of the other broadly majorly used is Figma. Figma is easy to use online tool which requires no installation. It also allows teams to collaborate more than 2-3 people at a time, live, fluid interface, and it's very efficient. Yeah. The most majorly used application in industry is Adobe XD. It focuses on designing and advanced prototyping. It also allows teams of designers to collaborate at the same time. And there are lots of plugins, design supports available, huge community support available in development phase. It's easy and very powerful designing tool, and it's a high fidelity prototype. So there's also some of three main things which we need to focus on. One is Google Material Design, Apple Human Interface Guidelines, and Adobe Jumpstart UI Kits. I have mentioned these links in the PPT. If you get chance to get into it, you can explore all these things, which basically tells what are all the design principles which need to be followed on development of an application, either it's a Swift-based iOS or Android, Windows, whatnot. Yeah, so let's start a basic application, which I'll be just going through it, not completely from the scratch. Just a second, let me share my screen. Keeping time constraint, like I'll just skim through the overall flow. So as you could see on the screen, this is an application that's been developed without writing a single piece of code, only with designing with the basic shapes and figures. So this is a music application which has the categories as we seen through Miller's law, and all the simplistic and most required features have been given at the bottom. So this can be interacted like how we actually interact with the application. Go on to the search, type something to search, come back, have a library of things, your downloads, playlists, albums, artists, and so on. So once we go on to playlist, we can actually check the songs which is playing currently, giving the cues of how much it's completed, how much are yet to be done, and with all the control icons and the logics given. And exploring other functionalities like Shazam, making it to recognize what we are listening, connect to various people, feed. So this is basically overall like application that is being developed only by designing. So we have this is an Adobe XD application which I have opened. So as and when you will be opening, you will be seeing this one with a blank screen. So you can create basically a new application and start developing it. So there is a thing called Artboard, which will be located. If you could download like at a later point of time and explore, you could find an Artboard which basically has a list of screens available. Say iPhone 10, iPhone 11, iPhone 12, all those or Android, Samsung displays, like with all basic displays which will be available. Or we can create a custom form, custom layout. As you could see, I have created one iPhone 12 display and one custom artboard for web design. So once we create this, we can use basic shapes like rectangles, bringing out the like rectangles, circles, lines, text, and colors to basically develop application something of this sort. So this basically consists of a background color. This consists of a background color and a picture on top of it. This consists of several concentric circles and disk-like images which you could see here, stacked on top of each other. So if you could dig deeper, there are plenty of screens which you can develop with wireframing, and we can portray, like we can replicate the same across in detailed high fidelity prototyping like this. Like you can see here, if you take only this screen as separate entity, this has a black screen. On top of the black screen, you have the search bar, which is a rectangle. See, you can like, this is a basic rectangle where the curves are rounded and bought like this. These are the icon packs, search icon, these are the text, and these has been developed with the basic shapes and pictures. So once we design all these, we can go into the next step called prototyping, which you could see in the top navigation bar. This is basically to bring out the real life experience of this prototype by giving animations. So if you could see, on clicking on this home button, bottom home button, which page should I navigate to? I can just click on this and I can go and tap it on any other screen which you have designed. So on clicking on this home button, it will basically redirect to this page. The animations can be given either from the preloaded basic set of animations, or we can develop our own custom animations by further increasing the number of pages. So this basically brings out the whole application process. I'll share a couple of links which we can go through it, like once you get the PPTs, in order to understand deep more into this user application development and platforms. Due to time constraint, I couldn't go completely. Yeah, just a second. I'll share my screen. Yeah. So next, moving on, like once we design UI UX design, once we make a prototype, as I've shown before, these designs have been tested iteratively over and over and over to figure out the flaws in designs and to make changes in a recursive, repetitive cycle. So once that's done, the design next moves on to the software development, testing, beta launch, and product launch. So these are basically a technical stages in the product development. So, as we said before, a good design can make or break a product. So, a generous amount of design principles has to be used while developing, with a minimalistic cognitive mental model along with the right mix of technical stack can make the product more successful. So if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer, and thank you.
Hello, sir.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
In case of data entry form or report, especially in the OLTP, online transaction process, is there any standard norms to have that kind of an data entry forms?
Yes, sir.
Standard
So,
guidelines as such.
yeah, it basically jot down to who's the user actually. If the user is of more technical in nature, then the analysis has to be done. What are the main key points which you have to focus? Let's say if the data entry is about a travel agency. So there, the number of we have to produce a list of all the customers, what are all their visits, their dates, their feedbacks, like all those things have to be focused upon. So it all jot down to what the customer is and what is the prior need, what is the important point which has to be entered. So by keeping in mind, we can design accordingly.
So there is not any standard guideline as such. So based on the user survey that has to define.
Yes, sir. Here, since it's all the user interaction, there is nothing right. There is nothing called like perfect right or perfect wrong. All these design principles are actually derived from the basis on heuristics and the mental models of how human behavior is. So only a proper user research and personas will help us to identify the key aspect which we have to focus on.
One more thing, templates are
Yes, sir.
available mostly on the web. So are
Sorry,
the
sir,
templates follow some?
Could you please
No,
repeat?
there are some standard template. Hello, sir.
Yes, sir.
I'm audible.
Yeah, you're audible now.
Yeah, there are some standard templates we download or we can even buy the templates, right, for even web and all that. So are this template follow this all the laws of UX and UI?
Yes. So here also we can't confirm 100%, but most of the developers, around 80% of the developers who are developing these templates are recognized and are been following these design rules and principles. To answer your question, yes.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
That's why it's
Thank you,
been
sir.
coming into light to like it's been listed out in public to for people to purchase it.
Okay, okay, good.
So any more questions? Like throughout the session, like from the previous topics too. So we are good to conclude now. Thank you, everybody. Any books? Yes, sir. I'll be sharing you the link and the PPTs, which has set of guidelines to start up with, set of principles that are followed in the company, some UI toolkits, and books. So basically, you will be getting it by the end of the day or by the end of this workshop, all the set of links and PPTs.
You can check the common drive, sir. We'll keep uploading there.
Yeah.
So if there
Thank
are
you,
no
thank you,
questions,
sir.
we'll wind up. Thank you, Arun Lakshmi, Vaibhav, and Venkat. It was a very informative session. Thank you. I think from participant sides, there are no questions. We'll wind up. Tomorrow also, we'll start by 10 o'clock. The same pattern. So tomorrow, we'll meet at 10 o'clock.
Ma'am, I have one question. Can I
Yes,
ask?
sir. Yes, sir.
Regarding,
Venkat.
is there, apart from this, regarding our attendance sheet, it be there or just you will take the screenshot
Attendance
of
will be captured automatically, sir. Like we have an add-on with this, so that will capture it. So no need of
Okay,
a
great.
separate attendance.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, sir.
Thank you all.